I want to tell you something before I start. I'm not a soldier. I'm not a scientist. I'm not some government official with a security clearance and a classified badge clipped to my chest. I'm nobody special. I was a truck driver from Scranton, Pennsylvania, hauling frozen food up and down the I-81 corridor for 11 years before any of this happened. So when people ask me, and they do ask me constantly, reporters and podcast hosts and documentary crews, they all say the same thing. Marcus, what was it like? What did it feel like when it started? And I tell them the truth. It felt like Tuesday. That morning, April 14th, the year everything changed. I had woken up at 4:47 a.m. like I always did. My body doesn't need an alarm anymore. 11 years of early hauls will do that to a man. I put on my boots, poured coffee from the machine I'd set the night before, and stepped out onto the loading dock of the Kelly Brothers distribution warehouse in Scranton to check my trailer seals. The air was cold. That sharp, clean cold that comes right before spring finally surrenders to warmth. You could see your breath. The sky was that deep navy color, not quite black, not quite blue, that only exists for about 20 minutes before dawn breaks. I remember thinking the clouds looked strange. That was it. That was my first sign that the world was about to become a completely different place. Not a boom, not a flash, not some dramatic movie moment with swelling music and a slow camera pan. Just clouds that looked a little strange. I stood there on the loading dock, sipping my coffee, staring up at them for probably 2 full minutes. They weren't moving the way clouds move. They weren't drifting. They were sitting, like something was holding them, like the air itself had decided to take a deep breath and hold it. Donnie, my dock supervisor, came out behind me. He was already complaining about something. Donnie is always complaining about something. And then he looked up too and just stopped talking. That was unusual enough on its own. Donnie never stops talking. "Those look weird," he said. And I said, "Yeah." And then we both went back inside because we had a schedule to keep. Frozen food doesn't wait for existential contemplation. I was 2 hours into my route, somewhere on the highway between Scranton and Binghamton, when the radio went. Not static, not dead air. Every station simultaneously switched to the same thing. Emergency broadcast tone. I've heard that tone before. Amber alerts, tornado watches. That time they thought the Susquehanna was going to flood in 2019. I turned the volume up out of habit. What came next wasn't a tornado warning. The voice, and whoever this person was, God bless them, because they sounded like they were reading from a script while actively having a heart attack, told me that unidentified craft had appeared simultaneously in the atmosphere above every major population center on Earth. Not near them, above them. 73 cities all at once. The voice said to remain calm. It said to stay indoors if possible. It said federal emergency protocols were being activated and that military assets were all ready. I turned off the radio. I don't know why I turned it off. Maybe I thought if I didn't hear it, it wouldn't be real. I drove for another 40 seconds in complete silence, watching the highway ahead of me, watching the perfectly normal trees and the perfectly normal highway signs and the perfectly normal exit ramps. Then I pulled over. I picked up my phone and called my daughter, Renee. She was 23, living in Philadelphia. Her phone went straight to voicemail. I called my ex-wife, Sandra. Same thing. I called my brother in Delaware. Nothing. Cell networks were already collapsing under the weight of 8 billion people, trying to call someone they loved all at the same time. I sat on the shoulder of I-81, parked behind a concrete divider with a truck full of frozen green giant vegetables, and I looked up through my windshield. The clouds were different now. They were glowing. Not like lightning, not like fire. It was something quieter than that. A slow, deep pulse, like watching a heartbeat through skin. Blue-white at the edges, shifting toward amber in the center. It came from above the cloud layer, from something sitting inside or just above the clouds, and the light breathed. Breathed. That's the only word for it. It breathed. And then the clouds parted. Slowly, deliberately, like curtains being drawn back. And underneath, above me, above the highway, above the trees, there was something that human language genuinely does not have adequate words for. People have tried. Journalists, poets, novelists, they say enormous. They say alien. They say terrifying and magnificent and otherworldly. All of those are true. None of them are enough. It was a vessel, a ship, though calling it a ship is like calling the Pacific Ocean a puddle. It was a geometric thing, not quite circular, not quite rectangular, with angles and surfaces that seemed to shift when you looked at them directly. It was dark along its upper hull but lit from beneath, where hundreds of ports or vents or apertures glowed with that same slow blue-white pulse. It was maybe 2 miles across, maybe more. And it was quiet. That was the thing nobody ever talks about. The thing that broke your brain the fastest. It should have been deafeningly loud. Something that size, hovering that low, it should have been shaking the ground, rattling windows, sending birds into panic spirals for 100 miles in every direction. Instead, there was almost nothing. A low subsonic hum, something you felt in your teeth and your chest more than you heard with your ears, like standing next to an enormous engine that was barely idling. I stepped out of my truck. I stood on the highway shoulder in the cold April air, and I looked up at this thing. And the thought that came to me, the very first coherent thought, was not fear. It wasn't awe, it wasn't wonder. It was, those poor bastards have no idea what they just landed in. I couldn't have told you why I thought that. Not then. It wasn't logical. It wasn't based on anything except some deep animal instinct that kicked in, the same instinct that has kept human beings alive through ice ages and plagues, and every catastrophe the universe has ever thrown at a small, stubborn species that refused to lay down and die. Something in my gut said, they've made a mistake. I just didn't know yet how right I was. The first official contact happened 11 minutes after the ships appeared. I know this because it's been documented 1,000 times, studied, analyzed, replayed. 11 minutes. That's how long it took the Galactic Sovereignty Fleet. That's the name we'd eventually give them, translating their own designation, to decide that Earth needed to be formally notified of what was about to happen. They broadcast on every frequency simultaneously. Radio, television, digital, analog. They interrupted streaming services. They pushed alerts to smartphones. They somehow transmitted through infrastructure that should have been incompatible with their technology. The message was translated by their own systems in real time, automatically, into every major human language. That was our first hint that they'd been watching us for a while. The message was, in its entirety, "People of Earth, your world has been designated for absorption into the galactic sovereignty. Resistance is acknowledged to be possible, but is calculated to be non-viable. Minimum civilian casualties are preferred. Your governmental structures should present formal surrender within 6 of your hours. This is a notification, not an invitation to negotiate." And then it ended. That was it. No preamble. No explanation of who they were or where they came from. No demonstration of good faith. No acknowledgement that this was, by any civilized standard, an act of unimaginable aggression against a species that had done absolutely nothing to them. Just a deadline. 6 hours. I heard this message sitting in my truck on the shoulder of I-81 through my phone's speaker, because 3 other truckers had pulled over near me, and one of them, a woman named Priya, who I'd never met before that morning, had her phone out and had found a live stream that was still functioning. We stood there in a loose, awkward cluster. 5 strangers on a highway. A truck driver, a woman who turned out to be a nurse driving to a hospital shift, a retired school principal, a college kid who'd been taking his first solo road trip, and me. And we listened to aliens inform us that our planet was being taken. Nobody screamed, nobody cried, not right then. The college kid, his name was Tyler. He was 19 years old and he was wearing a Syracuse University hoodie, just kept shaking his head slowly, like he was trying to clear water out of his ear. Priya was the first one to say anything useful. She said 6 hours, they gave us 6 hours. Why would they give us 6 hours if they could just do it? Nobody had an answer for that. But it was the right question. What the Galactic Sovereignty Fleet did not understand, what they could not have understood, because nothing in their recorded history of planetary absorption had prepared them for it, was what 6 hours means to human beings. 6 hours is nothing to most civilizations. It's barely time to mobilize, to communicate, to convene whatever governing body is supposed to respond. Most species, when presented with a deadline like that, spend the majority of it in shock, paralysis, internal debate about whether the situation is real. Humans spent about 12 minutes in shock. Then we got to work. I found out later, much later, in the debriefs and the books and the documentary interviews, what was happening in those 12 minutes of shock, and in the 5 hours and 48 minutes that followed. I'll tell you what I know now, stitching it together from everything that's been made public. Because this is the part of the story that the sovereignty never saw coming. This is the part where the mistake became irreversible. In Washington, the president had been moved to the National Military Command Center before the broadcast even ended. She was on the phone with her counterpart in Moscow within 4 minutes. Within 8 minutes, a three-way call had been established with Beijing. Within 15 minutes, the permanent members of the UN Security Council were in contact. None of them agreed on much in ordinary times. They agreed on everything in the next 5 hours. That had never happened before in recorded human history. Not once, not even close. In Norfolk, Virginia, the commanding admiral of the Atlantic Fleet had already ordered every surface vessel to sea before the message finished playing. Not because he had orders, not because someone in Washington called him. Because he looked at his radar screens, saw the size of what was sitting above the East Coast, and made a calculation. Sitting in port made his ship's targets, moving made them complications. He later said in his memoir, "I didn't know if our weapons could touch them. I still don't know for certain. But I knew that a moving target is always harder to kill than a still one, and I knew that my sailors would rather die trying than die waiting." Within 2 hours, the entire Atlantic Fleet was at sea. So was the Pacific Fleet. So was every submarine that could get underway. In NORAD, deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, analysts were doing something the sovereignty had almost certainly not expected. They were learning. The ships, all 73 of them, were broadcasting. Not intentionally, not communication signals, just the natural electromagnetic emissions of their drive systems, their power generation, their internal operations, the same way any machine generates noise. And human beings had been building instruments to detect, analyze, and decode electromagnetic signals for over a century. Within 2 hours, the signals had been mapped, patterns identified, frequencies logged. It wasn't much. It was nowhere near enough to understand their technology, but it was a start. And human beings, when given a start and no other option, are extraordinary. Here's something the sovereignty didn't know about us. We have a word, I'm not sure other species have this word or this concept, and I mean that sincerely. The word is spite. Spite is doing something difficult, painful, or costly not because it's strategically optimal, but because someone told you it was impossible, and you would rather suffer than let them be right. Spite is not rational. Spite is not civilized. Spite is not the behavior of a mature galactic species that understands its place in the cosmic order. Spite is, however, extraordinarily effective. I didn't stay on the highway. After maybe 20 minutes of standing there, watching the ship pulse overhead, Priya made a decision. She said she was going to the hospital, that her patients were there, her colleagues were there, and that was where she needed to be regardless of what was happening in the sky. She said it simply and without drama, the way people who do important things often talk about them, like it was obvious, like it was the only reasonable conclusion. The school principal, whose name was David, said he was going to his school. He said parents wouldn't be able to reach teachers, communication was down, and scared kids needed someone they recognized. The college kid, Tyler, looked at his car for a long moment. Then he turned around, looked up at the ship, and said, "And I will remember this until I die," he said. "I'm really glad I took this road trip." And then he got in his car and drove toward the nearest city. I thought about my truck, about my route, about the 30,000 pounds of frozen vegetables sitting behind me. Then I thought about something my father used to say. He used to say, "Marcus, when things go wrong, do something, anything, because motion is hope and stillness is surrender." I got back in my truck, and I drove. I drove toward Binghamton not because I had a plan, not because I knew what I was doing, but because my route went through Binghamton, and Binghamton had a hospital, and the hospital probably needed supplies in ways it didn't even know yet. I was right about that. The city looked like something between a snow day and the end of the world. Streets were quiet but not empty. People were moving, purposefully, with that particular kind of human determination that shows up when things get serious. Not chaos, not panic. People with their heads down, going somewhere, doing something. I passed a National Guard armory with its gates wide open and trucks pulling out. I passed a fire station where every truck was out of the bay and crews were loading equipment. I passed a grocery store where employees were already loading food into a van and an older woman in an apron, just a grocery store employee, nobody special, was directing the whole operation like she'd been planning for this her entire life. She probably had been in some way. We all had. Humans have always known, on some level, that the universe is too big and too strange to be permanently kind to us. We've always known something was coming. We just didn't know what shape it would arrive in. I got to the hospital and found a woman named Maya in the loading dock who was trying to figure out where to put supplies and what they needed. I told her what I had. She looked at me for about 2 seconds, then started pointing at bays. "Cold Storage Unit 3 is still running," she said. "Offload everything there. When you're done, if you can get back out and find anything else useful, fuel, medical supplies, batteries, we'll take it." She wasn't asking. She was just moving forward, and I was either in or out. I was in. I spent the next 3 hours making runs. Warehouse to hospital. Pharmacy supply depot to hospital. Hardware store, the manager had already opened up and was just letting people take what they needed to every medical facility I could find. I wasn't alone. There were other trucks, other drivers, other ordinary people who'd found something useful to do and were just doing it. Nobody coordinated us. Nobody told us to. We looked at the situation, looked at what we had, and figured out the obvious thing. That's so deeply human that I almost can't explain it to you. The capacity to look at a catastrophe and find the immediate practical problem and solve it, over and over and over, until either the catastrophe ends or you do. The 6-hour deadline came and went. There was no surrender. I heard later that the communication sent to the Sovereignty Fleet was something along the lines of, "We have received your notification. Our response is, no." 2 words. 2 of the most important words in human history. They'd done this before. I want you to understand that because it matters. The Galactic Sovereignty Fleet was not amateurs. They were not a rabble of aggressive space pirates or some hot-headed civilization making its first foray into expansion. They were experienced, systematic. They had absorbed 41 worlds before Earth. 41. Their methodology was refined. Their technology was generations beyond anything we had. Their tactical doctrines had been developed and tested over thousands of years of galactic expansion. And none of it prepared them for us. Their first mistake was the assessment. Before any invasion, the Sovereignty conducts what they call a civilizational yield analysis. It's essentially a calculation of how much resistance a target world can mount compared to the force being brought to bear. The yield analysis includes technological capability, military organization, planetary defenses, social cohesion, and what the Sovereignty classified as psychological surrender threshold, the point at which a civilization's collective will to resist collapses. For Earth, their analysis had returned numbers they were comfortable with. Our technology was primitive by their standards. Genuinely, significantly primitive. Our military hardware was laughably outdated compared to their fleet capabilities. Our planetary defenses consisted of things that were primarily designed to fight other humans, not an alien armada. Our social cohesion, and this is where they went very wrong, was rated as extremely low, because they had observed our history of wars, our political divisions, our conflicts, our genuine difficulty in cooperating on global problems. They saw disunity and calculated that it would persist under pressure. They had never seen what human beings do when someone threatens the whole species from the outside. The psychological surrender threshold was their most catastrophic miscalculation. Every civilization they had encountered had a threshold, a point where the cost of continued resistance outweighed the biological drive for survival, and the collective mind of a species chose to stop fighting. This threshold varied, but it existed. It always existed. The Sovereignty's analysts had calculated Earth's threshold at roughly 14% casualties. 14%. Meaning that if they destroyed 14% of human life on Earth, The remaining population would capitulate. They had reached this number by studying our history, by watching how human civilizations in the past had surrendered, collapsed, or submitted. They had models, data points. 1,000 years of human recorded history fed into their analysis systems. What they had missed, and this is the thing that keeps me up some nights, not with fear but with something like fierce, burning pride, what they had missed was the direction of human history. We had changed. Not completely, not perfectly, but significantly. The sovereignty had watched humans fight each other for centuries. Wars over land, religion, resources, ideology. They had watched us kill each other with astonishing efficiency and regularity. They had concluded from this that humans were a fragmented, self-destructive species with a limited capacity for unified resistance. What they hadn't correctly weighted was the lesson humans had learned from all that fighting. We were very good at war. Not because we enjoyed it, not because we were bloodthirsty or inherently violent, but because for thousands of years, war had been one of the primary sorting mechanisms of human civilization, and the species that survived that sorting process had become something extraordinary. We were adaptable, we were creative under pressure. We were capable of logistical operations of staggering complexity. We could absorb losses that would have collapsed other species' will, and keep going not because we didn't feel the pain, but because we had decided the objective was worth it. And when you threaten the whole species at once, when you give every human being on Earth the exact same enemy, you don't get a fragmented, squabbling civilization. You get 8 billion people who all just realized they're on the same team. The first military engagement happened at approximately hour 7. A sovereignty landing force, smaller ships, troop carriers from what we could determine, began descending from the primary vessel over northern Europe. The intent appeared to be establishing a ground presence, a demonstration of physical control. They came down over Norway. Norway is a country of about 5 million people, most of whom are deeply independent, historically tenacious, and absolutely nobody's idea of a pushover. It is also a country where civilian firearms ownership is common, where the population has a mandatory military service tradition, and where the landscape, mountainous, forested, crossed with fjords, is one of the most defensively favorable terrains on Earth. The sovereignty's landing force numbered, by later analysis, approximately 12,000 soldiers. Norway's active military was much smaller, but Norway's total armed population, including reserves and civilians with weapons in that area, much larger. The sovereignty soldiers were formidable. Their personal armor was beyond anything we had. Their weapons were devastating. The first engagements were brutal, and the losses on the human side were severe. But here's the thing about fighting humans on human terrain, in human weather, against humans who have been defending their homes since the Ice Age. We know every rock. We know every ridge line and every valley and every weather pattern. We know which forest paths freeze solid in April and which ones become mud traps. We know that the snow in the mountains is deceptive and the fjords are cold enough to kill in minutes. We know, in ways that are bred into us by 10,000 years of living in this particular piece of ground, exactly where to stand and where to make the enemy stand. The sovereignty landing force was designed for shock and awe, for rapid subjugation of populations who would be terrified by the display of overwhelming force. They landed in Norway and found people who looked at overwhelming force and said, "Good, we know where to put you." I wasn't in Norway. I was in Binghamton, still making supply runs. But I had found a radio by then, an old hand-cranked emergency radio from someone's basement, because cell networks were still mostly down, and I was listening while I drove. The reports coming in were fragments, confused, contradictory. But underneath the confusion, a shape was emerging. The shape was this. Everywhere the sovereignty tried to establish ground control, they ran into something they hadn't modeled for. Not just military resistance, human resistance. There's a difference. Military resistance has a center of gravity. There's a command structure, supply lines, communication nodes. You find the center of gravity and you attack it, and if you're powerful enough, the resistance collapses. Human resistance, when it goes cellular, when it devolves or evolves, depending on how you look at it, into a million individual decisions made by a million individual people, each one independently deciding to make themselves into a problem, has no center of gravity. You can't knock out the command structure because there isn't one anymore. Every person becomes their own command structure. Every household becomes a decision-making unit. Every individual who decides to be difficult becomes a separate problem you have to solve. The sovereignty had never encountered this. Their previous 41 absorptions had all featured civilizations with clear hierarchies, clear command structures, clear leadership that could be pressured or eliminated. Earth had all of that, yes. Earth also had, underneath that hierarchy, 2,000 years of accumulated tradition, folklore, religion, philosophy, and lived experience all pointing in the same direction. Do not give up. Especially when it's hopeless, especially then, that's when it matters. The second mistake was their weapons calibration. The sovereignty's standard pacification doctrine involved what their own terminology called demonstration strikes, targeted destruction of military infrastructure, government buildings, and communication nodes, designed to demonstrate overwhelming capability and encourage rapid surrender. They hit military targets with precision weapons in the first several hours. They destroyed radar installations, military communication relays, several air bases. What they did not do was hit civilian infrastructure, power grids, water systems, food distribution networks, transportation systems. This was actually their most humane choice. They were trying to minimize civilian casualties, preserve the planet they intended to absorb, and demonstrate that compliance would be rewarded. It was also their most catastrophic strategic error. Because humans, as it turned out, needed the power grid mostly for convenience. We could function without it. We had done so for the vast majority of our history. And when the grid went down in some areas, from damaged relay stations, from the disruption of normal infrastructure, from the general chaos of the situation, what happened? People lit fires, people started generators, people formed local networks, people figured out what they needed and went about getting it in the most immediate, practical way available to them. They improvised. Humans improvise like breathing. It's not a special skill for us. It's just what we do when the convenient option disappears. We look at what's available and we make something work, every single time. The sovereignty had conquered civilizations that collapsed without their infrastructure. That couldn't function without their power grids, their communication systems, their supply chains. They had never conquered a species that looked at a destroyed power grid and thought, okay, what wood is within walking distance? It was around hour 18 that the first cracks appeared in the sovereignty's certainty. I know this because one of the things that has come out in the years since, through captured data, through analysis, through the sovereignty's own records which they eventually shared as part of the treaty negotiations, is that their command staff began registering what they called anomalous resistance metrics at approximately the 18-hour mark. In plain terms, the numbers weren't adding up. Their models said Earth should be approaching surrender threshold by now. The demonstration of force had been executed. The infrastructure disruption was proceeding. The landing forces had established physical presence in 17 locations across 6 continents. And yet, the resistance wasn't decreasing. It was increasing. Every hour that passed, instead of wearing down human will, seemed to be generating more of it. Like the pressure wasn't crushing the spring but compressing it, loading it, building potential energy that had nowhere to go but back. Their commander, a being named in their language, something that translates roughly as Fleet Lord Sovereign of the Outer Expansion, and who we'd eventually call Commander Vareth in our own records, ordered a full analytical review at the 18-hour mark. What he got back must have been deeply uncomfortable reading. Vareth's analysts reported several things. First, human beings appeared to have a biological stress response that, rather than reducing capability, temporarily enhanced it. What they were observing in thermal and biological scans of human populations was massive neurochemical activation. Adrenaline, cortisol, various other compounds. That was measurably improving human reaction times, physical performance, and decision-making speed under pressure. In short, the threat was making humans more capable, not less. Second, human social structures under existential threat were demonstrating spontaneous, decentralized reorganization at a speed their models hadn't predicted. Communities were forming ad hoc councils. Resources were being pooled. Defense networks were self-organizing without top-down coordination. Third, and this one really got them, human combatants who had been defeated, who had been forced from positions, who had lost colleagues, who had experienced genuine military reversal, were not withdrawing. They were adapting. They were changing tactics. They were analyzing what had happened to them and modifying their approach. Vareth's analysts had a word for this in their own language. It translates, roughly, as persistence beyond rational threshold. For the sovereignty, this was classified as a psychological disorder, a malfunction of the survival assessment subroutine that all intelligent species were theoretically supposed to possess. They genuinely thought it was a malfunction. They thought we were broken. It was around this time that something happened that I was directly involved in, and which is probably why people keep asking me to tell this story. I had been running supplies for about 16 hours straight. I was running on coffee and that particular grim determination that sets in when you stop thinking about whether you can do something and just do it. My truck was on its fourth or fifth route of the day, and I was heading back from a pharmaceutical warehouse that a group of pharmacists had organized into an impromptu distribution hub. The ship was still overhead, visible from everywhere in the region, that slow pulse in the clouds. You stopped really seeing it after a while. It just became part of the sky. I was on a 2-lane road, about 8 miles outside the city, when I came around a bend and stopped. There were soldiers on the road. Not human soldiers. I want to try to describe them accurately because I've heard people get it wrong in the years since. They weren't the monsters from the movies. They weren't 8 feet tall with razor claws and nightmare faces. They were, and this is somehow more unsettling, they were plausible. Bipedal, roughly human in proportion, though somewhat taller on average, maybe 7 feet, 7.5 feet, with a head shape that was more elongated than ours, larger eyes that caught the light in a way human eyes don't, and hands with an extra joint in each finger. They moved with a kind of fluid efficiency that was deeply wrong in the way that something being too smooth is wrong, like watching a person who has had every unnecessary motion edited out. Their armor was extraordinary, not the bulky mechanical thing we imagine when we think of space soldier armor. It was contoured, almost organic-looking, with surfaces that seemed to shift between dark blue and black depending on the light. There was a faint glow at the joints and collar that I recognized by then as the same color as their ships. There were 6 of them, standing in a loose formation on the road. And they had stopped a school bus. I put my foot on the brake and sat there, maybe 150 yards back, engine running. The bus was fully stopped, hazard lights blinking. The 6 sovereignty soldiers were surrounding it. I couldn't see the driver clearly. I could see children's faces at the windows. I sat there for probably 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time to think. I thought, I have a 40-foot truck with a fully loaded trailer behind me. I am sitting on a road that goes straight to that bus. These beings have advanced weapons and armor. This is not a rational calculation. Then I thought, there are kids on that bus. I put it in gear. I'm not going to pretend I had some brilliant tactical plan. I didn't. What I had was a truck, a road, and a situation that required a decision faster than I could overthink it. I drove. Not at full speed. I didn't want to actually hit the bus, but enough. Enough that the engine noise was obvious and the truck was clearly moving with intention. I hit my horn. Sustained blast, the kind that carries across fields and wakes up neighborhoods. The sovereignty soldiers turned. I saw them process the situation, this big, loud, aggressively approaching vehicle, and they did something I didn't expect. They moved off the road. Not in panic, not in fear, more like recalculation, like they were resetting to figure out what was happening. That gave me 3 seconds. The bus driver, and I found out her name later, Joanna, 28 years old, had been driving kids to what she thought was a safer shelter outside the city. The bus driver took those 3 seconds and drove. She gunned it. Right through the gap the sovereignty soldiers had created by moving to assess my truck. The bus went past me going the other way, fast, and I saw Joanna through the window for just a moment. I don't know what my face looked like. Hers looked like a person who had just decided that today was not the day she was losing any of her kids, and who intended to make that decision stick by sheer force of will. She was right. The sovereignty soldiers turned their attention back to me. I stopped the truck. There was no real choice. Running wasn't going to work at this point. I sat in the cab for a moment, hands on the wheel, engine idling. Then I opened the door and climbed down. I don't know what I was thinking. I think I wasn't thinking in any organized way. I stood on the road in front of 6 alien soldiers with weapons I didn't understand and armor I definitely couldn't penetrate, and I put my hands up in the universal gesture that means, I'm not immediately attacking you. Let's talk. One of them approached. Up close, the size difference was more apparent. I'm not a small man, 6'2", and at that point in my life still carrying the frame of someone who has loaded and unloaded trucks for a decade. But the sovereignty soldier was meaningfully larger, and the armor added to that, and there was about it a quality of absolute physical confidence that was either very calming or very frightening depending on which side of it you were on. It said something. I didn't understand it. It was sound, structured, and clearly language, but nothing my brain had any framework for. I said in my most neutral and non-aggressive voice, I'm going to tell you that you're in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing to the wrong species. It looked at me. I don't know how to read sovereignty facial expressions. I didn't then, and even after years of contact, I'm still not great at it. But something about the way it regarded me, some slight tilt of that elongated head, suggested that it was, at minimum, processing something it hadn't expected. Then the translation device engaged. The sovereignty's translation systems, the same ones that had broadcast their initial message, were apparently capable of individual use. The soldier had something at his collar that, after a moment of apparent analysis, began generating something approximating English. What it said was, your resistance is non-viable, you cannot win this engagement. And I said, you'd be surprised what humans do when we're told we can't do something. I realize how ridiculous that sounds. One truck driver on a country road, exchanging philosophical observations with an alien soldier while 8 billion of his species figure out whether they're going to survive. But here's the thing. That conversation, that tiny, absurd, microscopically important moment, was happening everywhere. Not in truck cabs, not on country roads, in 1,000 different forms with 1,000 different people in 1,000 different situations. Wherever a sovereignty soldier encountered a human being who wasn't immediately surrendering, they ran into the same thing. Humans who weren't afraid enough to stop. An old woman in Seoul who refused to leave her house and told the sovereignty soldier at her door, to its face, with a kitchen broom in her hand, that her family had lived in this house for 4 generations, and she didn't care who thought they could take it. A doctor in Nairobi who kept operating through a demonstration strike, finished his surgery, then walked outside to find a sovereignty soldier and tell it, with calm, professional clarity, that his hospital was off limits. A fishing captain in the Sea of Japan who kept his boat at sea because the fish still needed to come in and his crew still needed to eat, and who, when a sovereignty patrol vessel approached, just kept fishing. A 15-year-old girl in Sao Paulo who spent 18 hours building a radio relay out of scavenged electronics, and managed to restore communication between 3 isolated neighborhoods. A construction foreman in Mumbai who organized his crew to fortify a hospital, not because anyone told him to, but because it was the obvious, useful thing to do. Over and over and over. Ordinary people doing ordinary, extraordinary things. Because that's what humans do. The sovereignty soldier and I looked at each other on that country road for what felt like a long time. Then his communication device spoke again. It said, "Why are you not afraid?" And I thought about that. I thought about it sincerely because it seemed like a sincere question. I said, "We are afraid. We're terrified. We're just not going to let that stop us." Another pause. Then something that might have been a question, though it came out as more of a statement. This is difficult to model. I almost laughed. I said, "Yeah, we're aware." I'm going to skip ahead now, not because what happened in the middle wasn't important, but because this story is already long and there's a part you really need to hear. By hour 42, the Sovereignty Fleet had suspended ground operations. Not retreated, suspended, there's a difference. They were still there, ships still hovering, weapons still active. But the ground engagement had stopped. The landing forces had pulled back to defensible positions and were maintaining rather than advancing. Their casualty numbers, something they hadn't truly planned for, were significant, not catastrophic. They were still, by any objective metric, the vastly superior military force. But they had expected ground operations to be largely unopposed beyond token resistance, and instead they had encountered something that kept adapting, kept costing, kept refusing to behave according to model. Vareth convened his command staff. I know what was said in that meeting because, and this still seems incredible to me, a sovereignty officer named something that translates roughly as Second Administrator of Territorial Assessment, kept detailed records of every command meeting, and those records are part of what was eventually shared in the treaty process. Vareth asked his analysts a simple question: what is the surrender threshold of this species? His lead analyst answered, we are not currently able to calculate it. Vareth, why not? The analyst, because our models assume a surrender threshold exists. The data from this engagement suggests that it may not, or that it is so far beyond our modeling parameters that we cannot currently determine where it is. There was, apparently, a long silence in the Sovereignty Command chamber. Then Vareth asked, what is our own casualty projection if we move to full pacification doctrine? This meant, what does it cost us to win by force, without restraint, maximum effort? The analyst gave him a number. And then the analyst said something that must have been very difficult to say to a sovereignty fleet lord. Even at full pacification, our projection for successful absorption is currently below acceptable threshold. This species has characteristics our models did not adequately account for. They are self-organizing in response to losses in ways that increase rather than decrease resistance velocity. Our best current projection at full pacification is extended engagement of indeterminate length with ongoing significant cost. Another silence. Then extended engagement, how extended? The analyst, current worst-case model suggests, generational. Vareth apparently did not respond for a long time. Because what the analyst had just told him was this: we might win eventually, but it might take longer than a generation. And in that time, the cost would be extraordinary, and at the end of it, they wouldn't have absorbed a planet. They would have broken one. A destroyed world was not the goal. The goal was absorption, resources, intact civilization to integrate into the sovereignty's economic and social structure. You can't integrate rubble. Vareth requested a direct communication channel to Earth's surviving governmental leadership. This was, in sovereignty history, unprecedented. Absorption procedures did not include negotiation after refusal of the initial surrender demand. It had never been necessary before. It was necessary now. The call was broadcast, not to governments only, to everyone. The sovereignty's communication systems put it on every surviving screen and speaker on Earth. I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria in Binghamton, eating something that was technically soup, when the speaker above me crackled and the voice came through. The translation systems were working better by then, more nuanced. Vareth said, I am requesting a conversation. And then, from somewhere, from a broadcast point that humanity's surviving communication infrastructure had cobbled together, a voice responded. I recognized it. It was the Secretary General of the United Nations, a woman named Dr. Amara Osai, who had apparently been coordinating from a secure location, and who spoke with a calm that made me feel both safer and more aware of the stakes simultaneously. She said, we're listening. Vareth said, I want to understand something. You are aware that we have the capacity to cause significantly more damage than we have caused. You are aware that your resistance, while admirable, cannot ultimately prevent our eventual victory. Given this awareness, why do you continue? A pause. Then Dr. Osai said, because we're human. Another pause, longer. Vareth said, that answer does not clarify. Dr. Osai said, I know, but it's the only answer that's accurate. We continue because we're human, because we don't stop when we're told we should, because the entire history of our species is a list of things we were told we couldn't do and did anyway, because there is something in us that reads impossible as not yet. because we have been afraid and tired and outmatched for the entire history of our civilization, and we are still here. A very long pause. Then Vareth said something that I think about often. He said, "We have encountered 41 civilizations. None of them responded to this situation as you have." Dr. Osai said, "We're sorry to hear that." And Vareth said, "I am not certain that is the correct response." Dr. Osai said, "Neither are we, but it's the honest one." There were 12 hours of back-channel communication after that. Negotiations, effectively, though that word implies more equality than the initial situation warranted. But here's the thing about 12 hours of communication between human diplomats and sovereignty analysts. The humans went into that process as the vastly inferior military power. They came out of it having made an impression that reshaped sovereignty policy. Not because they were clever, though they were. Not because they had leverage, though they were building it. But because every human diplomat in that process was simultaneously a person who had spent the previous 42 hours watching their species refuse to break. And that experience was in every word they said. You can't fake that. You can't manufacture the credibility of people who have just watched 8 billion of their fellow humans decide, individually, freely, without coordination, to be difficult to kill. The sovereignty, in the years since, has been quite open about what they missed. They have their own version of scholars, their own equivalent of historians and analysts, and several of them have written extensively, in terms that we can now read in translation, about the failure of their Earth assessment. I've read some of this. It's fascinating and strained, and occasionally inadvertently funny. One analyst wrote that the fundamental error was what he called phenotype behavior misalignment. In plain terms, humans don't look like what we are. We look, apparently, by the standards of galactic civilization, fairly fragile. Soft outer covering, no natural armor, limited sensory range, medium size, no obvious threat display. On purely physical terms, we're not intimidating. Every civilization the sovereignty had previously encountered with these physical characteristics had been, by temperament, cautious, risk-averse, inclined toward negotiation and accommodation. They had never encountered a species that was physically unimpressive by galactic standards, but whose psychological profile was, their word, in translation, ferociously persistent. Ferociously persistent. I kind of love that. What they also missed was our history. Not the facts of it. They had the facts. They'd been watching us for some time. They knew about our wars, our technological development, our political structures. What they missed was what the history meant. See, the sovereignty had used our history of internal conflict as evidence of disunity. And it is evidence of disunity. That's accurate. But it's also evidence of something else. Every war we had ever fought, every catastrophe we had ever survived, every plague and famine and natural disaster and self-inflicted crisis, all of it was practice. Not intentional practice, not training, but experience accumulated in the muscle memory of civilization. The knowledge, embedded in culture and tradition and literature and simple folk wisdom, that you can survive more than you think you can, that the situation that seems unsurvivable usually isn't, that people are more resilient than they look. This too shall pass, exists in essentially every human culture in some form. It cannot be done, is the most reliable motivator in human history. We are outnumbered and outgunned, is a description of the opening chapter of half of our greatest stories. The sovereignty had the data, they didn't understand the story. There was a particular incident that became famous afterward, not because it was the most militarily significant event of the engagement, but because it crystallized something important about the misunderstanding at the heart of the sovereignty's mistake. There was a sovereignty scout unit operating in northern Canada. Small group, 6 soldiers doing reconnaissance in a remote area. They had encountered some difficulties, navigation issues, some equipment damage from a skirmish, and were in a genuinely compromised position. A Canadian ranger found them. One man on patrol in his territory, with a rifle that was laughably inadequate against sovereignty armor, and a pack dog. He found them and he stopped. And then, instead of running or attacking or radioing for backup, he did something that apparently broke every model the sovereignty had for predicting human behavior. He made camp, He built a fire because it was cold. He made food because he had supplies and they looked like they'd been out in the elements for a while. He didn't point his rifle at them. He set it down next to him, within reach but not raised. He gestured in the universal language of come sit down, toward the fire. The sovereignty soldiers, who were indeed cold, because their environmental systems had been damaged, processed this situation for some time. Then they sat down. They sat around a fire with a Canadian ranger in the northern wilderness, and he gave them food he couldn't reasonably spare. And they sat there in the strange mutual bafflement of beings from completely different branches of life who have just found themselves sharing a fire in the dark. In the ranger's own words, from the interview he gave later, "My father taught me that if you want to understand someone, you eat with them." He didn't specify that they had to be human. The scout unit, when they eventually rejoined their fleet, filed a report on the incident. That report was flagged immediately by sovereignty analysts, because the behavior was, by their models, inexplicable. Not the kindness per se. They understood that some species showed resource sharing as a strategic behavior, a form of soft alliance building. What they couldn't model was the instinctiveness of it, the casualness. The fact that this human had extended hospitality to beings who were, technically, in the middle of invading his planet, not because it was calculated to be strategically beneficial, but because, apparently, it was cold and they looked like they needed a fire. One analyst wrote, in their account, "The human appeared to experience no cognitive dissonance between the macro context of the engagement and the micro context of the situation in front of him. He saw beings who needed warmth and gave them warmth. The invasion was, in that moment, simply not his primary consideration." Another analyst added, in a margin note, "This suggests a compartmentalization ability we have not previously observed in this form, or possibly a prioritization hierarchy that differs fundamentally from our models. The human placed immediate practical compassion above species-level threat assessment. They meant it as an analytical observation. I read it as a compliment." The negotiations took 11 days. 11 days during which the ships remained overhead, during which the world remained in a state of profound uncertainty, during which billions of people went about the extraordinary business of living as normally as possible under circumstances that were the furthest thing from normal. People went to work where work still existed. People cooked food and took care of children and checked on neighbors and fixed things that were broken. People argued about politics and complained about inconveniences and made jokes, dark jokes, absurd jokes, the kind of jokes that humans make specifically because the situation is too serious not to laugh at some part of it. People fell in love. Babies were born. Old people died peacefully in bed surrounded by people who loved them, because the universe ending is not sufficient reason to stop accompanying someone through the end of their particular universe. The sovereignty analysts noted this too, with obvious bafflement. One wrote, "Population appears to be continuing ordinary life functions at a statistically significant rate, despite the macro threat level. We cannot determine whether this represents unusual psychological resilience, cognitive failure to fully assess the threat, or some third possibility our models do not include." The third possibility. We were fully aware of the threat. We just decided that the way to face an existential threat was to remain human in the face of it, to insist, stubbornly and completely, on continuing to be what we were. Because if you change everything that makes you yourself in order to survive, in what meaningful sense did you survive? The terms of the settlement were, by sovereignty historical standards, extraordinary. Earth was not absorbed. Earth was not conquered. Earth was not pacified. Earth was designated, in sovereignty terminology, as a Class 1 autonomous sovereign world, a status that before Earth had been held by exactly 3 other civilizations in the entire history of the sovereignty's expansion. In plain terms, we were left alone. More than that, in exchange for certain agreements, primarily around joint research, resource trade, and a mutual non-aggression framework, the sovereignty extended something it had never extended to a non-member world, the protection of sovereignty law. We went from invasion target to protected sovereign in 11 days. Not because we won a military victory. We didn't, not by conventional terms. We won by being too complicated, too costly, too human to absorb. There was a press conference afterward, or what passed for a press conference in the still patchy communication environment of those days, a broadcast distributed through whatever channels were functioning, reaching who it could reach. Dr. Osai stood in front of what was left of a camera setup and answered questions for about an hour. She was visibly exhausted. She had the particular stillness of a person who has been running on adrenaline and purpose for 11 days and is only just beginning to feel the ground under her feet again. A reporter asked what convinced them to negotiate. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "I think we convinced them that we were a problem they couldn't solve, not because we were powerful enough to beat them, but because the solution to the problem, fully conquering a species with our psychological profile, was worse than the problem." She paused. They realized that they could win a war against us and still not win, that we would keep being human, that there's no version of this where we stop being what we are, and eventually they decided they'd rather have us as neighbors than as a permanent project. Another pause. I think they also, and I say this with all appropriate diplomatic caution, I think they were a little bit impressed. I went back to driving trucks. What else was I going to do? The routes were different for a while, some roads were damaged, some warehouses were gone. But food still needed to move, and I still had a truck, and there was still a certain satisfaction in the simple, concrete reality of getting something from where it was to where it needed to be. I thought about a lot of things on those routes in the weeks and months after. I thought about Joanna and the school bus full of kids. I thought about Priya driving to her hospital. I thought about David, the principal, going to his school. I thought about Tyler, the college kid who was glad he'd taken the road trip. I thought about a Canadian ranger who built a fire for his enemies because it was cold, and that's what you do when someone is cold. I thought about my father's advice. Motion is hope and stillness is surrender. I thought about everything humans had done in those 11 days. Not the dramatic things, not the military engagements or the political negotiations, or the strategic moments that got documented and analyzed and turned into books. The small things. The grocery store employee directing a food distribution operation because it was the obvious thing to do. The pharmacists organizing supplies. The amateur radio operators rebuilding communication networks from salvaged parts. The doctors who kept operating. The parents who kept their kids calm. The kids who kept their parents calm. The ordinary, absolute insistence of billions of people on continuing to be themselves in the face of something that should have been impossible to face. That's what won. Not our weapons, not our military, not our political leadership, though they were crucial. The fact that we couldn't be turned off. The fact that there is no version of human beings that surrenders the human part. There's a sovereignty word. I learned this years later, when translation became good enough to have these kinds of cultural exchanges. A sovereignty word that doesn't have a clean English equivalent. The closest translation is something like the quality of persisting beyond the point of rational calculation. In their psychology, it was a flaw, a malfunction, the failure of a species' self-preservation algorithm to correctly assess the cost-benefit of resistance. In the years since first contact, there have been ongoing exchanges between Earth scholars and sovereignty analysts. Philosophical exchanges, cultural exchanges, genuine attempts to understand each other. And apparently, I heard this from a researcher who works in cross-species communication. Apparently, there is a growing body of sovereignty scholarship that has re-examined that word. That is re-examining whether persisting beyond the point of rational calculation is a flaw or something else entirely. Whether there is a kind of intelligence in it, a kind of wisdom. Whether the species that fights past the point where fighting makes sense is not malfunctioning, but operating according to a different and perhaps more profound calculation, one that places the value of what it means to be itself above the value of survival alone. I'm not a philosopher, I'm a truck driver from Scranton. But I think about that word sometimes. I think about what it means that the thing that impressed the sovereignty most about us, the thing they couldn't model, couldn't predict, couldn't overcome, was just us being ourselves. Being stubborn, being compassionate, being afraid and doing it anyway, building fires for strangers, running toward the hospital instead of away from it, driving toward the bus instead of waiting for someone else to do something. Being human. There's a plaque now. It's in the lobby of the United Nations building, which was rebuilt. It was put there as part of the formal commemoration of what got called, officially, the 11 Days. It has the text of Dr. Osai's final statement from the negotiations, the last thing she said to Vareth before the treaty was signed. He had asked her, apparently with genuine curiosity, not hostility, what she thought humans could offer a galactic community that had 41 member worlds and thousands of years of history. She had said, "Probably nothing you don't already have in better form. Our technology is behind yours. Our political structures are messy. Our history is complicated in ways we're still figuring out. We're not particularly impressive by the standards you're used to. But I can tell you what we are. We are the species that builds fires for strangers. We are the species that drives toward the problem instead of away from it. We are the species that, when the universe tells us we can't, says not yet. We haven't figured out yet whether that's a feature or a bug. But it's us, and we're not negotiating that part." I drove past that building once, when I was making a run through New York. I didn't stop, I had a schedule. But I looked at it through my windshield as I passed. And I thought, yeah, that's about right. The last thing I want to tell you, the thing I keep coming back to when people ask me what I really think about all of it, is something small. It's not a dramatic thing. It doesn't end the story with a bang. About 3 months after the 11 days, I was on a route through Pennsylvania, early morning, that same cold before spring air that I remembered from the morning it all started. I stopped at a diner I'd been going to for years, little place outside of Wilkes-Barre, and I ordered the usual. There was a woman at the counter next to me. Older, maybe 70, with that particular steadiness that comes from having been through things and come out the other side. We started talking, the way you do in diners on early morning routes. She told me she'd been a nurse. Retired, but she'd gone back to her old hospital during the 11 days, worked 16-hour shifts for the whole duration because they needed people who knew what they were doing. I told her about my supply runs. We talked for a while, drank coffee, watched the sun come up outside the diner windows. At some point she said, "You know what I kept thinking the whole time?" I said no. She said, "I kept thinking, this is going to be a good story someday." She laughed a little. "Isn't that ridiculous? We're in the middle of an alien invasion, and I'm thinking about how it's going to make a good story." I thought about that. I said, "No, I think that's human." She considered that. Then she nodded. "Yeah," she said, "yeah, I think it is."